I mentioned last week that for the most part, people are drawn to those folks who do things that seem impossible. We're sometimes mesmerized by superhuman feats of daring or skill. What's interesting is this week I ran across an old series on Netflix that originated in Canada, and it's called Risk Takers. And I remembered its popularity years ago because of the daredevil deeds of people or groups of people that they highlighted on the show. Each week they would focus on certain careers or hobbies that they defined as risky. Stuff like the Coast Guard's rescue swimmers or bounty hunters or stuntmen. Some of the nonsensical activities that they showcased were skydiving and bungee jumping. Some like to watch these kinds of things. We're in awe of some. At some we laugh at. We cringe in fear, but sometimes, and then sometimes we just kind of wonder why. What's interesting is there's always been risk takers, people who are seemingly unafraid to try anything and everything. The term risk is defined as the potential that a chosen action or activity or inaction will lead to an undesirable end. The world has its share of those who will climb Mount Everest or just because it's there, swim the English Channel just because that hasn't been done that way before, or those who put their lives on hold to pursue a dream of sailing across the Pacific Ocean on a log raft. When you think about it, without risk takers, our lives would be more difficult than what we think it is, because risk takers expand the boundaries of what is and what can be done. In a way, we admire their strength, we admire their tenacity, we admire their courage, but at the same time, we kind of hate them for showing us just how much we can but don't do. In fact, the matter is that Jesus calls his disciples to be risk takers. In Matthew chapter 10, at verse 21, Jesus says, "Now brother will deliver up brother to death, and father his child, and children will rise up against parents, cause them to be put to death, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end will be saved. But when they persecute you in the city, flee to another, for assuredly I say to you, you will not have gone through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for a disciple that he be like his teacher, and a servant like his master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more will they call those in his household? Therefore do not fear them, for there is nothing covered that will not be revealed, and hidden that will not be known." And in verse 38 he says, "And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it." The charge of service that Jesus gives his disciples carries with it the risk of many problems and even painful losses here on earth. Jesus said, if they persecuted me, they will persecute my disciples, because my disciples are not above their master. And then Jesus warns that if we do not take the risk, if we deny him before men to avoid risk, he will deny us before the Father, resulting in our eternal death. Therefore, we take up the cross, accept the risk, and follow Jesus, no matter what the consequences might be. You know, the Bible has its share of risk takers, those who took the risk to work for God despite the potential outcome of their choices. While all the other Jews cringed in their trenches and hidey holes, David took the risk, went out to challenge Goliath, who was the enemy of God. While most of the nation acquiesced under the intimidation of Jezebel's influence, Elijah dared to take the risk to tackle the system of the day in an effort to turn the people's heart back to God. Threatened by the most powerful king of the most powerful nation of that time, Hezekiah refused to surrender Jerusalem or Judah because God promised him through the prophet Isaiah, "I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land." We want to look at three more specific examples of risk takers that we read about in the scripture. Abraham accepted the risk of having to leave his homeland, family, and friends, and go to an unknown place. In Genesis 12 at verse 1, now the Lord said to Abraham, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. And then the Hebrew writer writes in chapter 11 at verse 8, by faith Abraham obeyed when he called to go out to the place which he had received as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. And that's a great risk. God calls upon Abraham to leave everything he knew, everything and most everybody had known from his youth, family and friends, leave the security of his hometown and homeland, leave the security of being familiar with its surroundings, his neighbors, knowing friend from foe, etc. He put all of behind you and go to a different place, and I'm not even going to tell you where it is, God commanded Abraham. And what were the risks? Well, to say the least, he could have lost his herds and servants or possessions. God may have led him to a place that was full of robbers and thieves. Certainly, he might have lost his family members. He was afraid that the king of Egypt and King Abimelech would steal Sarah from him. Abraham could have lost his very life in the hands of those in the land God was going to lead him to. There were many risks involved with Abraham's call. But as the Hebrew writer says, Abraham accepted those risks in order to do what God commanded him to do. Another example is Moses. Moses accepted the risk of having to return to Egypt. Before, Moses was thinking that the time was right for him to take a role of leadership in the Jewish nation. Actually killed an Egyptian one day who was beating one of his brethren. But Pharaoh finds out, and Moses, who had lived in the king's house, actually became a fugitive. 40 years later, at the age of 80, Moses is called by God to return to Egypt, face Pharaoh, lead his brethren out of Egypt to the promised land. In Exodus 3 at verse 3, then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses, and he said, here I am. And then at verse 10 it says, come now therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? So he said, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Again, there were many risks involved in Moses returning to Egypt. First, obviously, he's wanted for murder, but also the Jews had rejected him the first time, and they may have rejected him again. At the very least, he could have been enslaved along with his brethren and forced to do Egyptians' construction work. But it is revealed to us that eventually Moses accepted those risks and did what God commanded him. The Hebrew writer writes in chapter 11 at verse 25, by faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ of greater riches and than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. And finally, another example is Esther. And Esther accepted the risk of having to speak up and speak to the king to save her people from the enemies of God. The story of Esther is a wonderful story of faith and providence. Esther was a Jewish girl who became queen when Xerxes was the king of the Persian Empire. And it was after she became queen that Haman, an advisor to the king, became jealous and angry at Mordecai, Esther's uncle. Haman had used his relationship with the king to have a law passed that on a certain date, all the people throughout the kingdom were to kill all the Jews that were in their cities and region. Esther was the only one in the position to save the Jews, from Haman's plan. And so she is approached by her uncle, by a special messenger. In Esther chapter 4, beginning at verse 10, then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's province know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law, put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he might live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words, and Mordecai told them to answer Esther. Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Esther's reply shows all the readers the great risk that she took to approach the king to help save the Jews. After fasting and praying for 3 days, Esther approaches the king without an But the king finds favor with Esther, and she ends up thwarting Haman's plan, which led to having Haman hanged on a gallows that he built to have Mordecai hanged on. When we think about these three and the risks that they take, there were some things that they had in common. First of all, they all suffered some kind of fear as they followed God's instruction. Abraham's fear is revealed when he asked Sarah to lie about being married to him. Moses' fear was seen when he argued with God about returning to Egypt. Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to the Pharaoh, that I should bring the children of Israel back? Esther's fear is realized when she told her uncle that if she went into the king without invitation, it would be possible that she could be killed. One writer writes, fear in and of itself is not sinful, for fear is a natural thing and natural and necessary for man's preservation, implanted in us by the provident and most gracious giver of all good things, to the end that we might not run headlong upon those dangers which we are not able to encounter, but use the remedy of shunning those evils which we are not able to withstand. But sometimes our fears takes us in the wrong direction. There's a story told about Nikita Khrushchev, the time that he was the premier of the Soviet Union. And he was in the habit of denouncing many of the policies and atrocities of Joseph Stalin. Once, as he ridiculed Stalin in a public meeting, Khrushchev was interrupted by a shout from a heckler in the audience. He's saying, you were one of Stalin's colleagues. Why didn't you stop him? And Khrushchev roared, who said that? Total silence followed. Nobody in the room dared move a muscle. Then Khrushchev replied quietly, now you know why. You see, risk takers shared the emotion of fear. But from our example, we see that risk takers also shared the attitude of faith. By faith, Abraham left his homeland, trusting God to care and provide for him. By faith, Moses obeyed God. The Hebrew writer says, by faith he forsook Egypt. He returned in spite of all the dangers and fulfilled God's mission. By faith, Esther faced the king. I will go to the king which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Faith is the intellectual attitude that overcomes the emotional response of fear. Our emotion tells us that something is dangerous. The possibility of hurt, harm, or loss of status, loss of possessions, or even loss of life might occur. The 10 faithless spies looked at the land of Canaan and responded with fear. In Numbers 13 at verse 27, they told him and said, we went to the land where you sent us and truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. In verse 31, but the men had gone with it, said, we are not able to go against the people, for they are stronger than us. In verse 33, we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak, came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight. So we were in their sight. You see, fear ruled their reasoning, and then fear clouded their conclusions, overwhelmed what little faith that they had. On the other hand, Joshua and Caleb's faith was stronger than their fear. You see, faith trumps fear. In Numbers 13 and verse 30, Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it. And then chapter 14 and verse 8, if the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into the land and give us a land that flows with milk and honey. All of the risk takers that we have mentioned were guided by their faith, and because of their faith, they were willing to risk all for the Lord. But notice also, these examples of risk takers also shared the status of favor. They were all favored by God and received his blessings, protection, and provision. This favor was the reward of their faith. Abraham received the blessing of being the father of a nation of Israel and the beginning of the lineage to Christ. Moses received God's favor and defeated the nation of Egypt with God's mighty help and led the people to the promised land. And even though he sinned in the matters of striking the rock at Meribah and wasn't allowed to enter the land of Canaan, Moses was allowed to enter the eternal land of rest. A reward far greater than, as he described, the physical reward, the good land beyond the Jordan and those pleasant mountains of Lebanon. Esther won favor of the king, and her life was spared, but she also won favor of God and received his protection and salvation for her people and from Haman. So when we think about risk takers for the Lord, they share fear and faith and favor. The fact of each of us should want to be risk takers, and risk takers for the Lord, and that is really what we're called to become. And if we're unwilling to take the steps that might lead to some indesirable end on earth, we might want to examine ourselves as to whether or not we're really in the faith. To become a risk taker, we must, first of all, refocus our fear. In Matthew 10 and verse 28, Jesus said, do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. All of our examples feared the consequence of disobeying God much more than what might have happened to them in their service on earth. When we stop fearing what man might do to us, or what man might think about what we say or about us, then and only then will we be willing to do any and all of what God commands us. I want to repeat a quote I used in one of the thoughts worth sharing this week. General Charles Gordon, the British defender of Khartoum, wrote, if God smiles on you, neither the smile or frown of men can affect you. But to refocus our fear, we must first of all rekindle our faith. Only by and through faith will we be victorious in our endeavors for the Lord. Without the substance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen, we will never have the courage to accomplish all that God commands us to do. Faith enables us to see when the eye cannot. Faith makes easy the most unselfish service required of us. Faith enables us to endure extreme trials without murmuring. When dangers arise, faith lights our path and gives us courage. Faith enables us to overcome doubt and temptations. In 1 John chapter 5 and verse 4, John wrote, for whatever is born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. If then, because of faith, we are willing to overcome the fear and do what God's command, we too will receive God's favor and the rewards he has promised us in time as well as eternity. We're called by God to risk being accused of being accused of being different and strange, of being disliked and hated by others, of being shunned and shut out, even by those who are closest to us. See, by faith we can have the courage to accept the risk and live through the troubles of life. So we ask the question, are you a risk taker? You see, to receive God's favor and rewards, we must become one by becoming a Christian and devoting our life to God's service.